patrons of the 80s Slasher Library are allowed to listen any further. Got your library card? Good. Tonight, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dreamspawn, Chapter 8. Nervous anticipation took on a whole new meaning for Jane once she agreed to go out with Brandon. Like Lola, he came out of left field. Oh, Christ, it wasn't even a field. It was more like he was from another solar system entirely. But that drawing absolutely won her over. He had found her true weak spot, the need to feel beautiful and special. Jane felt badly for writing off Brandon as a typical jock so thoughtlessly. She got up extra early that morning before school to experiment with makeup and apply it more carefully than usual. She felt obligated to try and figure out the whole baffling process once and for all, and even printed out several helpful hints from websites devoted to various techniques. Ultimately, all she wanted was the ability to manage a typical gothic sweep of black liquid liner and to find a way to keep her mascara from smearing. It was particularly difficult in the hotter weather to not come home with dark smudges under her eyes. For the first time ever, she considered asking her mother about contact lenses. In the past, she would never have dreamed of asking for such a frivolous and uncharacteristically vain item. Now it suddenly seemed like a reasonable idea. Without naming names or providing any explicit detail, Jane blew off a little of her dating angst on her live journal, describing her battle with the mascara wand in what she hoped was a witty and self-deprecating way. When she posted her entry, she felt a little lighter, more centered. Luckily, that morning the heat had subsided and a haze settled over the face of the school, leaving Jane's mascara on her lashes where it belonged. It'll probably burn off, Jane thought glumly, but at least it's not relentlessly sunny. As soon as the day started, Jane remembered that they were heading into midterms already. For once, that was her only real concern as she navigated the hallways. The unprecedented acceptance she and Lola had won with their victory over the bullies, Viva la Revolution, put her at such ease that she realized she'd been defensive most of her life. She had sort of grown accustomed to the pinch between her shoulder blades and the heavy sarcasm that crouched under her tongue. She would always be cynical, to be sure. The world would ever be a bleak, miserable, and unreliable place that would invariably conspire to wear her down and destroy her happiness. But she didn't have to slink through day under the unmitigated assault of her so-called peers. But was she truly happy? There was no point even thinking about it. She hadn't really been happy since the day her father passed away when she was 11. At first, all they knew was that something had stolen in and wiped out her father's immune system with silent cat burglar stealth. In the beginning, he had the flu all the time and complained of all sorts of pains. Well, he didn't really complain, more like he made faces and insisted he was okay when he clearly wasn't. Her mother panicked at the unusual number of infections and viruses, the weight loss and the fatigue, and forced him to have an HIV test. Jane remembered the tearful arguments that ensued. Accusations of infidelity, possibly homosexual relationships. For a time, Jane withdrew from her mother, thinking she was horribly cold for making her father feel so badly when he was already sick. She didn't realize that there might have been some history or reason for the accusations. Later, when they lived in San Francisco, her mother explained as much as she could to Jane. There had been an incident that her mother refused to say much about, except that it ruptured every seam of trust in the marriage. By then, Jane was older and a little more understanding, and her mother had not said a bad word about her father since his death, so she was able to forgive her mother, as much as any teenager can forgive a parent. But her father's illness were one day followed by a moment that was a turning point of all their lives. They were moving yet again, and her father lifted a box, nothing heavy, just some kitchen stuff, pots and pans and things like that, and he cut his finger on the point of a protruding knife. He'd had a niggling pain in his lower back, but suddenly there was a lightning strike to his entire spine, and his finger bled like he'd cut his wrist. He dropped the box and cried out as he seemed to implode there on the carpet, in a pile of quivers and gasps. Jane ran to him and tried to help him stand, but he couldn't get up. Then she saw the blood. Her mother was packing the car with the computers when she heard Jane screaming. Her mother's face turned sickly white when she saw her husband crumpled on the floor. She grabbed a dust cloth and tried to stop the bleeding of his finger, having Jane press on a place farther up on his arm. When her mother couldn't get him up and into the car, she tried to help him lie more comfortably. That's when she saw it, A red stripe ran down the back of his calf. "Watch your father," she said, scrambling to her feet and going into the kitchen. The next thing Jane heard was her mother on the phone asking someone to send an ambulance. At the hospital, her father learned that the stripe was a blood clot. But that wasn't all. The cat burglar had finally unmasked. He had leukemia. Jane was left with her grandparents while her father was transported by ambulance to a special cancer center at Stanford. Later, when he underwent treatments, Jane watched him suffer through the slow torture of chemotherapy. He lost his hair and had what he called the devil's hangovers, where he would vomit all day, but nothing came up. Sores encrusted his mouth like barnacles. He still got sick, a lot. It was as if he was 10 times sicker than he was when he was just getting the flu every other week. He slept all the time and didn't want to eat. The doctors promised that they had high remission rates, that it was something her father could beat in the short term, if not for many years to come. But there was no cure. He would be susceptible for years once they drove the beast back into its cave. The worst part was not knowing what caused it. They told Jane that leukemia has no known risk factors. They thought maybe genetics and environmental factors were an influence. However, Jane quickly discovered the real truth behind all the medical rhubarb and patronizing hand-patting. The truth was they knew absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Her father collapsed completely not long after the treatment. He was far too sick and the cancer was too far spread for the chemotherapy to do anything. They talked about bone marrow transplants. They had to find a family member willing to donate bone marrow. While her father lay in the hospital dying, her mother desperately made phone call after phone call. Siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles. Every one of them had the same answer. Everyone refused to help. Of course, by then it was too late. One night, just a week after the moving incident, her father started bleeding in his brain. They immediately performed surgery, but it was no use. He was gone. Jane would never forget the stiff, practiced sympathy on the faces of the doctors, telling her they did their very best. 4 years later, Jane read that they finally figured out how to treat acute promyelocytic leukemia without chemotherapy. Time and medicine had robbed them, cheating them by 4 short years. 4 years? Was that it? Chinese researchers had apparently discovered the cure years before, but it hadn't been accepted by American doctors. Jane found this on the internet and, against her better judgment, showed her mother. While her mother took it well at first, Jane watched her slip into a prolonged depression. Neither of them could function well after that. Knowing that there had been a treatment that could have saved his life was too much. After his death, Jane often dreamed of her father. Sometimes she would wake up in the night to find a form slumped in a chair she'd set in the far corner of her room. "Hi, Daddy," she would whisper. The form would listlessly shift, gently breathing. Jane would softly whisper the events of her day, her fears and innermost thoughts, and her father would listen. Never answer, just listen. Jane knew in her heart that it was just a dream. He wasn't really there. Her waking self knew this, but it still felt good to have someone to talk to. She missed him with a vast, aching intensity that never really went away. Since they moved to South California, Jane had not dreamed of her father, not even once. Then again, she had not set up the chair for him either. On her way to third period, Jane noticed a sullen girl with shoulder-length, licorice red hair. Her bangs somewhat choppy and uneven. A ring pierced the curve of her candy apple lower lip. Unlike Jane's delicate eyeliner job, the girl had smeared thick black coal around her lids in cinder smudges, heightening the ethereal shine of her willow-green eyes. Those eyes flashed like Amtrak train lights across the hallways. They were so striking. Most of what she wore looked second-hand. A tight black skirt that seemed as if it had been cut shorter and left unhemmed, and a long-sleeved white cotton t-shirt with the ribbing torn out of the neck. On her big feet were strange, crumpled silver flats, the metallic coating starting to flake away from the leather. She didn't fit any particular subculture that Jane could identify. She just seemed kind of surly and unapproachable. But the most noticeable thing about her was her build. Her full breast and a round, saucy backside that strained the fabric of her clothes with a tiny hourglass waist between. Unlike Ashley's boyish hips that contrasted with her ridiculous adolescent boob job, this girl's flesh was completely natural, perfectly proportioned and oozing XXX everything. No matter how she could have tried to hide her figure, only a Barnum and Bailey circus tent could have obscured her generous natural endowments. While the girl had many enviable attributes, one pale cheek bore 4 deep scars, as if the claws of a big cat had struck her face. The scars were perfectly parallel, so neat, in fact, that Jane wondered if they were made on purpose, like some form of ritual scarification. When she and her mom lived in San Francisco, Jane's neighbor had an enormous German eagle scarred into his back, the open wings touching the midpoints of his shoulder blades. His name was Jake. He was in his mid-20s with long brown hair and a goatee, and he always called Jane Little Sista. Jane saw the scarring one day when he was shirtless, carrying his basket of laundry to the laundry room. He noticed her staring and showed it to her, explaining how they'd cut the eagle into the skin and then how it scabbed real badly. He said it was okay for her to touch it. Jane ran her fingers over the pattern, fascinated by the swelling etched into his flesh. It was surprisingly detailed, like a tattoo, but without the ink. He was a very cool guy, in fact, Jane had to admit, because he also knew all sorts of trivia about the German Renaissance, as well as Victorian England. He would dress up in period costume and go to the Dickens Fair with his girlfriend, who wore bustle skirts, corsets, and bonnets. Jane was insanely jealous and desperately wished he'd had it for her mom, or better yet, herself. But she knew that was never going to happen. Besides, her mother was way too square and too old to ever like a guy like that. But the scars on this girl could have been accidental too. Or perhaps they were inflicted by someone out of malice? It made Jane slightly nauseated to think of it. The girl seemed almost proud of them, like dueling scars. Was she from San Francisco or Los Angeles? Maybe even as far away as New York? She could have been from almost anywhere. Jane felt confident she could pinpoint where the girl came from if she could only hear her speak. As Jane moved on, she heard a girl behind her whisper to her friend, "I bet she's a lesbian. She looks like some kind of lesbo psycho whore." The voices shifted in the multiplying crowd of students, and Jane lost the source of the disparaging remarks. Jane doubted highly that this girl was gay any more than Lola was. It was just that, like Lola, she did not edit her appearance in order to conform to the desires and expectations of men, the way that all the other girls seemed to do. And somehow that simple fact was so profoundly disturbing, so utterly against everything they had been taught that mattered, that they were all forced to fall back on easy, predictable insults to distance themselves from what they did not understand, and therefore must both hate and fear. Apparently the girl did not hear the comments, but then again, Jane always ignored comments like that herself and tried not to react to them. Jane watched for her when she went to lunch and noticed the girl shrinking against the far cement hallway of the smoker's corner in the courtyard, withdrawn and murky as she drew on a cigarette. She stared steadily at the ground as if it were whispering to her. It spooked Jane a little, but she herself had had many days of ground snooping in the not-so-distant past. She all but forgot about the new girl until she met up with Lola and Amber down by the wall after the final period. They were dishing on the guys they had been with and how far they had gone. Amber was telling horror stories about various jocks, like one of the football players who had chased her for weeks, and then been so trashed the night she finally said yes that he passed out on top of her. She had to scream and scream until 2 of his buddies realized her cries were distress, not ecstasy, and freed her from beneath his insolent 225-pound frame. And as Lola downed a bag of cheesy tortilla chips, she wove an entertaining, tantalizing tale about tying one of her boyfriends to a bicycle rack, filling him up and then leaving him there, exposed to the caresses of the wind and anyone else who might happen by. Apparently this happened on a regular basis, and he very much enjoyed it. Lola exposed and humiliated him whenever she got a chance, and this made them both very hot. "But what would happen if someone found him?" Jane asked. "He'd be busted," Lola replied, sucking orange dust off her fingers, "and I'd laugh, but usually we didn't get into trouble at all. I do stuff like that all the time. There was this one guy who wanted to be my pet, so I could cuff him to the stair railing by my class and make him wait until I got out." "No way," Amber said. "If anyone could keep a boy pet, it would be Lola," Jane ventured. Did he like do tricks and stuff?" Amber asked. Lola wriggled her eyebrows. Hell yeah, and I taught him every single one. The two girls high-fived, Lola using the non-cheese-dusted hand. Jane felt distinctly left out. Her experience with boys was very limited. She'd had many crushes based entirely upon fantasy and the boys' GPA, but nothing more substantial. A number of those crushes were deeply conflicted scenarios in which she loved the boy for what he was, usually brilliant, and hated him for what he was not, in love with her. This legacy followed her from grade school to the present, at which point she had concluded that the male race had earned her permanent contempt. Until maybe now. Another clique of about 4 girls, wealthier ones whose parents gave them their own credit cards and had them spend their summers in Florence or Nice, formed a clot on the nearby stairs, much to the annoyance of Jane. These were ultrachic fashionistas who only dated college boys and spent most of their time obsessively accessorizing and worrying about things like this season's new skirt length or whether or not their new cell phone cover had the right look to adequately offset the fun, frivolous but still edgy Debbie Harry on crystal meth look they were going for that millisecond. They were frequently overheard referring to whatever new heel height, hairstyle, or sexual position struck their fickle fancies as the new whatever they used to like the day before. Prozac is the new Slim Fast. The 80s are the new 70s. Oh my God. They had never been a real direct menace to Jane, except for 1 or 2 passing comments about that goth thing being so over, so she mostly ignored them until that day. Their leader was Devin Berlin, a tall Jennifer Aniston wannabe whose eyes were set just slightly too far apart. She was notoriously tight in every way, money, ass, favors. Her real estate mogul daddy bought her a BMW Boxer, making every other car in the school parking lot look like a junk heap. Since it was only a 2-seater, you had to really earn her favor to get a ride. Like a queen, she dolled up and doled out such favors as if they were knighthoods. If anyone knew you'd been in her car, you were the envy of the school. Devin often mistook advantage for accomplishment, especially since she had been class president for the last 2 years running. She fully expected to win again this year, Jane had heard, despite everyone in her class tiring of her entitlement issues. Like Amber once had, Devin held court often and kept a small, endlessly rotating roster of female quarters, turned out from the mid-ranks of intelligence but the upper echelons of privilege and fashion. She tended to keep lower-class men around her, fleshing out her entourage so that no one would notice when her popularity was waning. Jane sighed at Miss Cinder Eyes coming from a mile off, as she stopped to sling her bag onto the stone wall and slip a textbook inside. Devin's foot soldiers eyed the girl's clothes, and one of them remarked, "Nice outfit, where'd you get it? The donation box at the Salvation Army?" Devin's friend snickered and made disparaging faces, as if being poor were a grave social offense, like pissing in public or vomiting on your best friend's shoes. Devin herself kept quiet and let her courtiers carry the heraldry into battle. That way, no one could accuse her of bad-mouthing anyone or committing social offenses of any sort. Ever the budding politician, Devin always kept her own hands clean. Miss Cinder Eyes didn't even look their way, but instead gave Devin and her trendy minions the one-fingered salute as she rummaged in her oversized army surplus backpack. "Such vulgarity," Devin said, more to her cohorts than the girl. "I don't think that's appropriate on school grounds." "Yeah, maybe she's retarded and can't talk," Devin's vice president, Monica Moore, offered, a slim, dark-haired girl in Calvin Klein's and an expensive hippie-dyed cotton Betsy Johnson t-shirt that read "Love Me Like Twiggy," and her braces were so apparent. She was Devin's right-hand bitch, enforcer, and some said the real power behind Devin's throne. "Scarface kind of looks like she belongs in a cage." Miss Cinder Eyes zipped up her bag, keeping her finger in the air. "Eat my shit, bitch. If you got any teeth, that is." She shouldered her backpack and glanced dead at Devin. "Which I doubt." Jane heard Amber inhale sharply. She seemed to know that something was coming, but Jane didn't. What could a small clique of prissy-rich snobs possibly dish out? "I've got better teeth than a baghead like you," Devin responded, turning to Monica. Monica slipped her hand into her backpack and pulled out something slim, black, and glossy. Jane couldn't tell what it was, but she heard a small pop when the girl brought her hands together. One hand dropped to Monica's side, her hand discreetly covering the item she held. Miss Cindereyes glanced at them warily, then tried to move past them by walking a wide circle around the group. But as she moved around them, Monica dropped her bag, broke away from her friends, and lunged like an Olympic fencer at the girl's back, extending her hands towards her shoulder blades. Before anyone could see exactly what had happened, the harsh chemical burn of a permanent Sharpie pen wafted past Jane as she watched Monica slash repeatedly at the girl's white shirt. The Sharpie was fresh and left wide. Black sweeps and scribbles on the girl's shirt. The girl tried to get away, but Monica bore down on her. "Leave me the fuck alone!" Miss Cindereyes cried. The other students watched her suffer, some merely stepping aside to avoid getting bled upon by the ink. She tried to grab the pen, but the girl had already done a great deal of damage to her shirt, and now jabbed her with it whatever she could ink her. "Oh, fuck that," Lola said, tossing her bag of chips to the ground. "Come on." Immediately, Lola was on Monica, and Jane reluctantly followed before she could lose her nerve. Each girl grabbed one of Monica's arms, and Lola peeled the pen out of her hand, while Jane reprimanded her. "You're a lousy artist," she hissed in Monica's ear, "and a lousier human being." "Well," Devin said, "if it isn't Lesbo Lola and her dumpy sidekick, the Velvet Manatee." Monica wrenched herself free and turned to face them. Lola held the open pen like a pistol at the surprised girl, waving her on. "Bring it, bitch! You want some of this on your Calvins?" Meanwhile, Amber sauntered over to Devin and what was left of her quarters, staring her down. Devin raised an eyebrow. For the first time, the two stood on opposite sides of the fence. This fact seeped into Devin by degrees in the few seconds of silent exchange. At last, Amber spoke. "I don't think keeping this kind of company will further your political goals. In fact, I think it's going to hurt. Bad." "You're not even supposed to be here, Amber." She made Amber's name sound like an insult. "Why don't you run off to your little AA meeting and mind your own business?" "You know what? I fucked your boyfriend," Amber said, mocking her, with a killer smile bright and vicious, and Jane shuddered, remembering what it was like to be on the business end of Lioness Amber's formidable claws. "Last year, on the night of the junior prom, outside by the bleachers, I made him beg for it." She paused, allowing her prey to take a few bleeding steps, then dropped her voice and went in for the kill. "How'd my pussy taste when he kissed you for your prom portrait, Devin?" Devin blanched. "Come on," she said to her friends, gathering them to her defenses. A wet sheen of shame and insecurity glistened in her eyes as she turned to leave. Monica backed away from Lola and snatched her backpack from the ground before resuming her place in Devin's entourage. Lola found the cap on the sidewalk and capped the pen, while Jane approached the strange new girl who was fretfully examining the black marks that striped her shirt and one of her sleeves. She then stroked the scars on her cheek with her inky knuckles. A distance in her eyes Jane sensed was unreachable. "Are you okay?" Jane asked her. Those willow green lanced Jane with the heat of indignation. But after a beat, the girl nodded and smiled. "Thanks," she said. "I'm Jane DeHaan, and this is Lola Cole and Amber Dunn." Lola grinned, extending her hand. "We're the Petticoat Mafia," she said. "We champion damsels in distress and tie up boys if they're lucky." The last bit got a finger under the girl's lid, and she smiled, shaking Lola's hand. "I'm Rose." She seemed to gauge the brigade further and then added, "Rose Gibson." "Good to meet you, Rose," Jane said. She could smell traces of cigarette smoke clinging to Rose's clothes and hair, along with a kind of cheap, peachy perfume. "Well," Rose said, "see you around." The girl ducked her chin to her chest and turned away. Jane watched her go with a strange feeling in her stomach that she could not quite define. That night, another nightmare. Upon waking, Jane had to struggle to remember the rapidly disintegrating details, clutching at fragments and trying to reconstruct the puzzle of the dream. Miss Cindereyes had been there, wearing a tight red and green striped dress and walking silently through the empty school. Her shadow was too long and thin, trailing behind her, and bleeding onto Jane's shoes as she followed. Ants swarmed over the walls in busy, regimented lines, and the floor seemed wet, slick with salt water. Jane realized that the girl was crying as she walked, copious tears splashing at her feet and forming puddles on the scuffed green floor. There were more vague, confusing details that did not hang together. Rows of connected wooden chairs like old-fashioned theater seats lying in splintered piles, with crows perched on them, preening on their upturned legs. Rows of blank gray monitors giving Jane the distinct impression that they had been showing a critically important live image seconds before she turned to look. She remembered a broken ladder and some curious little machine that was made from parts of a dead dog. That counting song was playing over the static of the PA system on a loop. And then suddenly it seemed that there was this vast, yawning pit in the center of the third-floor hallway, sullen heat radiating up from the unknowable depths. The girl poised on the edge of the hole, and Jane called out to her, terrified that she was about to leap. The girl turned to the sound of Jane's voice, and her feet stumbled, the raw lip of the pit crumbling, and she fell. Jane could not save her and woke with a deep, guilty anguish in her rapidly beating heart. Jane didn't see Rose again until the end of the following day. Jane had lingered talking to Brandon in the hallway about their date later that night and was drifting along in a hormonal stupor when she spotted Rose, thoughtfully taking a last drag on a cigarette as she left the school grounds. She was dressed in the same ratty skirt as the day before, paired with a different ink-free shirt that was otherwise identical to its predecessor. Jane waved to her and she waved back, a little more happily than Jane had expected. Taking this as her cue, Jane ran to catch up with her. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Jane said, indicating the faded pen marks that still marred the irritated skin on the back of Rose's hands. The girl had obviously scrubbed her skin raw, trying to remove the black scribbles. Jane imagined that there were probably more under the new shirt, where the permanent ink had soaked through the fabric the day before. "Why should you be?" Rose checked the marks and shrugged. "You didn't do it." "I meant I'm sympathetic," Jane said, "not apologetic." Rose nodded, dropping the cigarette on the ground and crushed it beneath her foot. "So, where are you from?" Jane asked. "Originally, I mean." Rose pulled her hands up into the loose sleeves of her shirt and turned away. Silence. "I'm not from here myself," Jane added. "We just moved down from Seattle." Rose said nothing and just started walking. "I transferred from Canoga High," she finally said. "That's not far away at all," Jane said, trotting to keep up with Rose's brisk, determined stride. "Did your parents have to move?" "Foster parents," Rose said, frowning. "Let's just say I didn't get along in that school either." Jane wasn't one to push or ask too many questions. She let Rose keep that information to herself and assumed that she'd had similar trouble to the misadventures of the day before. Trouble had certainly followed Jane no matter where she went, and she had lived in more places than she cared to remember. Rose was so provocative that she had to have encountered even worse situations than Monica's Sharpie attack. Perhaps it was why she had those scars on her face. "I'm headed over to this coffee shop called Java 6 to meet Lola and Amber," Jane said. "Why don't you join us?" Jane was starting to feel too warm in the afternoon sun. She wondered why Rose wore a long-sleeve shirt. It was thin and cotton, but still strange. "I hate coffee," Rose said, eyeing Jane like she suspected her of ulterior motives. "Well?" Jane felt awkward under the girl's intense green scrutiny. She looked down at the toes of her Victorian boots. "But you know what? Some company would be nice," Rose said, her gaze softening. "I don't really have any friends." Jane smiled. "I don't have any either, until I met Lola." As they walked the 6 blocks to the coffee house, Jane told Rose the tale of Amber's abduction and subsequent Patty Hearst-like induction into the ranks of geekdom. Rose listened thoughtfully, occasionally chewing at the ragged skin around the edge of her thumbnail. "So, this petticoat mafia," Rose said. "What exactly do you girls do?" Jane shrugged. "Oh, I don't know. Smash the oligarchy of the popular, avenge the downtrodden, destroy the beautiful people." Jane laughed. Mostly we just stick together no matter what. No matter what, huh? Rose asked. There was a peculiar edgy glitter in her willow-green eyes that made Jane a little uncomfortable. Sure, Jane said. No matter what. Rose paused and lit another cigarette, inhaling like it was her last breath. What do I have to do to be in your gang, then? She asked. Jane had never actually thought about that before. It had just sort of formed organically up until that point. Well, nothing really, she said. Just be picked on, I guess. I think you're more than qualified in that department. Does that mean I'm in? Rose asked as they rounded the corner by Java 6. Well, obviously Lola and Amber need to approve, Jane said, but I can't imagine why they wouldn't. Rose paused before the door to the coffee house and suddenly hugged Jane very hard. Jane raised her arms to return the unexpected embrace, smelling cigarettes and peaches, and another odd, sort of tarnished brass tang lurking beneath it all. She patted Rose's back, uncomfortably aware of the other girl's curves against her own. Rose broke the hug and ditched her cigarette. Together they went inside. Lola and Amber were already there at the usual table. They waved as Jane and Rose went up to the counter to order. Mr. Backwash, hope renewed by his curvy new addition to their daily coffee clash, tried the free scone and band flyer routine on Rose. Rose smirked and ordered a glass of milk. Don't bother, Slick, Lola said, slinking up behind Rose and taking her arm. She's mine. Lola and Jane led Rose back to their table. Rose was frowning tensely into her glass. I'm not like that, Rose said. I don't like girls. Lola burst out laughing. Neither do I, silly, Lola said. But that loser will have a hard-on for a week, imagining that we're a couple of lesbos. A relieved smile spread across her face, and Jane realized that she really was quite pretty, with the pinched expectation of torment lifted from her wide, pale brow. So, what's your story? Lola asked, stilling a piece of Rose's orange cranberry scone. Not much to tell, really, Rose replied. My parents died in an accident when I was 7, and I've been bounced around through the foster care system ever since. Some foster families were okay, and some weren't. She paused and took a sip of her milk. Mostly, I just keep to myself. Lola turned the questions to topics like Rose's taste in movies, books, and music, all of which were eclectic beyond belief. But Jane could not bring herself to ask the one thing she really wanted to know. The scars. Where did she get those scars? So I guess you're one of us now, Jane said instead. Like to our newest member, Amber said, raising her cup in salute. Lola grinned, chanting, One of us! One of us! Jane and Amber joined into the chant, and Jane was surprised to see a sheen of tears in Rose's willow-green eyes. Chapter 9. The double date was Lola's idea. She and her latest pet, a punk rock drummer moonlighting as a paramedic, would accompany Jane and Brandon to dinner at their favorite Thai place, and then return to Lola's to watch The Others, that ghost story with the death portraits that Lola had mentioned that first day they hung out together. Jane would have felt more comfortable going out to a theater or someplace more public to watch a movie with a date. But the current crop of simpering romantic comedies and brain-dead shoot-'em-up action flicks made her mind up for her. Jane had only ever been on a handful of study dates in her entire life, and those could barely even be called dates, since the young men involved were often oblivious to her inner romantic turmoil. This would be the first time she was being taken out by an actual suitor, who was clearly and unapologetically interested in her. She was terrified. Sitting in the tub and marinating in hot, lavender-scented bubbles, Jane stewed and fretted. She struggled to shave her legs without too many nicks while obsessing over what to wear. She did not want to give him the wrong idea by wearing something overly provocative. But at the same time, she did want to look her best. As she dried her body, she found herself stealing glances in the steamy mirror. Did he really like her belly? It didn't seem possible. She turned sideways, sucked her belly in, and smoothed it down with her hands, then let the air out in a rush. Her belly returned to its normal rounded curve. Well, like it or not, she was still going to wear control-top pantyhose, just to be on the safe side. She dusted herself with lightly scented powder and brushed out her long black hair till it gleamed. A few drops of bergamote eau de cologne beneath each ear and inner wrist, and she started to feel almost desirable. Lola had offered to do her makeup, so she just washed her face and smoothed on a light moisturizer. At least her skin was good. Lola was plagued by zits, but Jane seemed magically immune. She gave her towel-wrapped self a last critical once-over, and then scurried from the bathroom. Selecting undergarments for this date took on a whole new level of anxious torment. She told herself that it shouldn't matter, since there was no way he would be seeing her smalls anyway. Yet she knew she would not feel right in her normal granny panties and heavy-duty bra. She wanted something that would make her feel special, more fabulous than her mundane daily self. After rejecting several options, she finally settled on a sculpted black lace push-up bra and matching panties that were still full-backed. She would never submit to that horrifying and torturous modern atrocity known as the G-string, also known as butt floss. But at least were lightweight and feminine. She added smoky black pantyhose and a tight knee-length, black spandex pencil skirt that she had quit wearing because she thought it made her ass look too big. Now, seeing herself with Brandon's eyes, she saw that the skirt just accentuated her curves, rather than disguising them as she usually did. She fussed over a choice of top, tossing away several in frustrated angst before winding up back to the first one she chose, a flattering corset top of burgundy silk that featured a subtle, monochrome floral design. She pulled the laces on the top until her cleavage was nicely plumped, and then wound a long strand of Victorian jet beads several times around her neck. Tiny jet drops in her ears and chunky-heeled shoes with a rounded toe and a thick strap around her ankle, and she found she was as ready as she'd ever be. Her mom got all maudlin and teary-eyed when she saw Jane in the hallway on her way out. Jane had tried to sneak out without a sappy, "My little girl's all grown up," encounter, but it seemed as if there would be no avoiding it. "Oh, sweetheart," her mom said, tucking an errant lock of her hair behind Jane's ears. "You look so pretty." "Thanks, Mom," she said, extricating herself gently from her mother's clutches. "I gotta go." "Promise me you'll be safe," her mother called out. "Do you need condoms?" Jane rolled her eyes, mortified. "Mother," she said, hand on the doorknob, "my virginity is not in danger. You know I'm saving myself for a long-term relationship. He's a nice guy and all, but it's just a date, nothing more." Her mother shook her head. "I don't know where you get your quaint Victorian morals," she said. "Certainly not from me. Things were different when I was your age." "Please," Jane said, holding up a palm. "Whatever teenage indiscretions contained in your personal romantic history, I feel that sort of information should be kept from me." Her mother smirked. "Well, have fun," she said, "and be home by midnight, Cinderella." She gave her mom a swift peck on the cheek and headed over to Lola's. Lola was dressed in a tiny plaid skirt that barely covered her boyish ass, purple fishnet stockings, and a long-sleeved black mesh shirt over a heavily padded purple bra. Purple knee-length Doc Martens and weird purple plastic wrist cuffs completed the ensemble. Her purple hair was screaming away from her scalp in stiff, frozen spikes, and she had the same purple stuff smeared around both her eyes, and across her lips at that. Sitting in Lola's makeup chair again, Jane watched with amazement as Lola transformed her face. "I can't get over your skin," Lola said, holding Jane's chin and turning her face one way and then the other. "You don't even need foundation, girl." Lola insisted on tweezing away the stray hairs around Jane's thick black eyebrows, and then brushed pale, icy frost over her eyelids and up to the brows. She added a deep, ashy purple into the creases where the edge of her eyeballs met the curve of her sockets, and applied liquid eyeliner in a flawless black sweep along the lash line of both eyes. A touch of mascara to the outer lashes only, and a dark berry-colored gloss across her lips, and she was ready. She put her glasses back on and looked in the mirror, stunned by the way her dark eyes seemed larger and more luminous without looking garish or drag queen-like. Even behind her glasses, they were arresting and lovely. She puckered her lips, tasting something faintly fruity, and thought suddenly of Brandon. wondering if he would try to kiss her, if she would let him. A chilling scream scattered her contemplation, and she nearly leapt out of her skin. "Doorbell!" Lola said. "You ready, Juliet?" Lola did not give Jane time to answer, just left her there with her arms wrapped around herself, wondering if she was Cinderella or Juliet, heart banging like an angry prisoner inside her chest. It was Brandon. He was immaculately dressed in well-pressed black trousers and a black short-sleeved button-up shirt. It took a moment for her to realize that the white buttons on the shirt were actually tiny skulls. "Hi," he said, and pulled a green paper cone from behind his back, offering it to Jane. Nestled inside were 3 perfect white calla lilies. "Thank you," she said, looking down at her shoes. I better get some water." Lola grinned and handed her a big, paint-splattered mason jar. She turned away and busied herself at the sink, snipping a careful inch off the stems with Lola's pocket knife, and setting the graceful blooms in the jar. She loved calla lilies, so elegant and tranquil, and so unlike something a high school boy would choose to give his date. Roses were unimaginative and cliched, and so were the kind of trashy carnation-heavy mixed bouquets you could get for $5 at Walmart. But these 3 flawless flowers had obviously been thoughtfully selected from an actual florist, each one fresh and perfect. According to the Victorian language of flowers, calla lilies meant magnificent beauty. As she carried them over to where Lola and Brandon stood laughing at her, she thought in a sudden foolish panic. She struggled to calm herself and slow the manic samba beat of her heart. She sat the flowers down on Lola's work table before her shaking hand caused the water to slop over the tip of the jar. The screams sounded once more, and again Jane jumped, a little. Brandon grinned, and Lola ran to answer the door. Jane stood beside Brandon, silent and awkward for what felt like forever. She could smell his various grooming products and the fabric softener in his clothing. He didn't smell overly cologne, just clean and warm with a faint, citrusy undertone. Jane felt sure she was blushing and wondered if she had put on too much perfume. Or maybe not enough. "You look beautiful," Brandon said quietly. Before Jane could come up with some clever and self-deprecating reply, Lola returned with her date. His name was Randall, and he was still in his paramedic uniform, bulky navy windbreaker and work pants with a light blue shirt, featuring the hospital's name on the left breast. He was well over 6 feet tall and thin as a shiv, with cadaverous cheekbones and dyed black hair showing nearly an inch of reddish-blonde roots. He must have been at least 25 and kissed Lola like he wanted to eat her. She shoved him back, laughing. "Cool it, Rambo," she said. "We're chaperones tonight, right?" "Right," Randall said, winking. "Your chariot awaits." Jane was totally appalled to find an ambulance parked in Lola's driveway. "We're going in that?" she asked, incredulous. "Sure," Lola said. "That way, if you knock Brandon lights out for putting his hand on your leg, Randall can revive him." Lola rode shotgun in the front, while Jane and Brandon sat together on a narrow vinyl bench in the back, surrounded by creepy and complex medical equipment. "What if someone gets shot or has a heart attack while you have the ambulance?" Jane asked anxiously. "Well then, it's right along city," Randall called from the front, thumbing the siren and scooting through a red light. "Hope you've got a strong stomach." "What?" Jane clutched involuntarily at Brandon's massive arm as the ambulance swung a hard left. "What does that mean?" Lola punched Randall in the shoulder. "He's kidding," Lola said, "and he better knock it off if he expects to get any." "Yes, ma'am," Randall said, pantomiming zipping his lip. When they pulled into the lot by the Thai restaurant, several of the business owners in the other shops that shared the mini-mall stuck their heads out of the doorways at the arrival of the ambulance. When the 4 of them got out and made their way into the Thai place, everyone went back about their business. Inside the restaurant, Jane started to feel a little more at ease. The conversation flowed, and the food was spectacular, but she still found herself intensely aware of Brandon's every move beside her. He was a lefty, and she was right-handed, so there was a fair amount of comedic elbow bumping over the course of the meal, and she could feel his thick, muscular thigh brush occasionally against hers beneath the table. He handled chopsticks like a pro, and doodled on the paper placement while he talked. Little skeletons and calla lilies, bats and dice, and of course, Calavera again, this time fighting a Garuda-like Thai demon. In order to avoid Brandon's dark, magnetic gaze, Jane found herself watching his hands. They were thick, scarred, and blocky, exceptionally broad across the knuckles, and utterly unlike what one would picture as the hands of an artist. Brutish, wrestler's hands. But yet they moved eloquently through the air when he spoke, and created such fine, meticulous detail in the curlicues of the Thai demon's wings. Jane forced herself to mentally catalog his flaws. All the reason why he wasn't right for her, in an attempt to talk herself out of the deep crush that was brewing inexorably inside of her. But it was as if her usually dominant mind had been hijacked by the runaway steam engine of her hormone-saturated body. When the check came, Brandon insisted on paying for everyone, even though Jane knew he was not wealthy. "Come on," Brandon said to Lola. "I wouldn't have been able to get this beautiful woman to give me the time of day without your help. It's the least I can do." They left, Brandon gallantly pushing open the smoked glass door for Jane and helping her into the back of the ambulance. Back at Lola's, Jane and Brandon sat on the battered couch. Brandon sprawled comfortably in the center, and Jane, with knees primly together, jammed anxiously up against the left arm, making as much space as possible between them. Lola stuck in the DVD and dimmed the lights, snuggling up with Randall on cushions on the floor. The movie was excellent, beautiful and engrossing, scary without the appalling amount of bloodshed that seemed unavoidable in modern movies. The plot twists were no real surprise to Jane, who had read many stories that followed a similar theme, but it was still quite good. So much so that halfway through she stopped paying attention to Brandon's closeness and Randall and Lola's necking. Brandon, to his credit, was a perfect gentleman. No phony stretching out to sneak an arm around her, no untoward advances of any kind, and she found herself relaxing and setting back into the couch as she watched. When it was over, Lola stood and stretched up to her tiptoes. "Right," she said. "You know, suddenly I'm starting to feel this strange pain right here." She pressed her fingers into her belly just below her navel. "My panties feel so tight. Someone call an ambulance. I think I'm gonna faint." She collapsed into Randall's arms, and he tossed her, giggling over his shoulder. "You're on your own, kiddo," Lola called as Randall carried her off. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." The studio door opened and closed, and Jane and Brandon were alone. Shyness enfolded Jane like claustrophobia, and she wrapped her arms across her belly. "I'd like something to drink," Jane said, "just to have something to do." "You want a soda or something?" "Sure," Brandon said. "That'd be great." Jane leapt up and nearly ran to the big industrial fridge. Inside were bloody lumps wrapped in cling film and jars with mysterious shapes floating in murky red fluid. A blue china plate had a curious rubber sandwich sprouting slick alien tentacles. A gory and horribly realistic severed poodle head could be seen under a glass cake dome. Jane hastily grabbed 2 cans of soda without even checking the labels and shut the door. "Dr. Pepper or 7-Up?" she asked, holding up the 2 cans to see what she wound up with. "I'll take the Dr. Pepper," he said. Jane sat back down, holding her soda but not opening it. Brandon took a deep drink from his and then turned to her with a sheepish smile. "I guess I'm a little nervous," he said. "I haven't been on a date since I moved here, and, well..." He trailed off and looked down at the can in his hand. "What about..." Jane picked at the hem of her skirt. Well, Amber said..." "Said what?" he asked. "That you were with an older woman?" Jane blurted before she could stop herself. He looked at her curiously and then looked away. "That was a long time ago." "I'm sorry," Jane said, blushing thickly. "I just heard that..." "No, it's okay," he said. "Her name was Lupe. She owned the restaurant I worked in back in Corpus Christi." Jane waited silently for him to continue. He took another sip of his soda. "She was beautiful, voluptuous like you. She loved to eat, and she was always cooking, always offering me little tastes of this and that. Her mole could make you break down and cry. It was that good. She hooked me like a fish, strung me along for 3 months, then I found out she was married. I wasn't the first busboy she had her way with, and probably wouldn't be the last. I thought I loved her, but she was just using me. She kind of broke my heart." He smiled and shook his head. "I've dated some other girls here and there, but I just never felt right with any of them. I guess I still have a hard time trusting people. Plus, my family moves so damn often, I never have time to really get to know anybody." Jane nodded. "Really? Me too," she said. "In the last 4 years, I've lived in Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Boston, and Atlanta." Brandon laughed. "Guadalajara, Austin, Corpus Christi, Phoenix, Stockton, and Santa Ynez. I got you beat by one." "My mom's a database administrator, a computer geek. She keeps on getting transferred and let go, but now it looks like she's been hired on permanently here at this latest company." "Got any brothers or sisters?" Jane shook her head. "Just me and her." "Dad?" Jane frowned and opened her soda. It spritzed a chilly mist across her fingers. She took a sip. "He died," she said. "Leukemia. I was 11. "Oh, I'm sorry," Brandon said. "What about you?" Jane asked. "Any siblings?" "7 sisters," he said, "but they're all married now except for one. My dad dumped my mom when I was just a baby. Left her with 8 kids and ran off with the blonde soap opera actress. I was the only man in the house." "Wow," Jane said. 8 kids?" "My mom, she's an artist too," Brandon said. "She's got a lot of radical ideas about politics and stuff. She edits this Spanish feminist magazine that tries to help poor Mexican women to take charge of their lives and their reproductive rights. It was hard for me growing up because so many other people were against her and her anti-Catholic ideas. Calavera was my only real friend." Jane looked up at Brandon again, and he was looking right at her. She held his gaze, heart thundering in her chest. "You're a good listener," Brandon said. "I feel like I can really talk to you. So many of the girls I know are completely shallow and self-centered. They don't really listen to anything you say. They just set their faces in this fake, interested expression and wait for it to be time for them to talk." "I like to listen," Jane said. "It's a lost art. Only there hasn't been anyone in my life worth listening to in a long time. I didn't have any real friends either. Really not until I met Lola." Brandon took Jane's hand, caressing the ridge of her knuckles with his thumb and sending skittering shivers over her skin. "Thanks for saying yes," he said. She had no idea what to say to that. In fact, she had no idea of anything at all anymore. It was as if his touch had short-circuited all thought processes, and her body mutiny against the stewardship of her brain was finally complete. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a relatively chaste, closed-mouth kiss that landed slightly towards the left corner of his lips, but she could not believe what she had done. She pulled back and raised her fingers to her lips, smearing her lip gloss. I'm sorry," she sputtered. The look in his dark eyes went from surprise to smoldering in a heartbeat. He touched her cheek, hands sliding along her jaw and cupping the back of her neck beneath her hair, as he pulled her gently forward until her breast pressed against his chest. With his other hand, he took her glasses off, set them on the table, and returned the kiss. His kiss, on the other hand, was decidedly unchaste, mouth soft and slightly opened against hers, tongue sliding out to taste her, gently at first, and then with a tightly contained urgency that she found impossible to resist. His hand caressed the curve of her waist and the nape of her neck, and she was appalled to find her hand seeking out the shape of his body, the shifting muscles of his broad back and chest, and the softly stubbled curve of his head where it joined his thick neck. His skin was amazingly soft and smooth over the coiled steel of the muscles beneath. She pulled him closer, swiveling her hips involuntarily towards him as she kissed him, and he gripped her ass, lifting her until she was half in his lap, straddling one of his thighs with her skirt, riding high up on her nylon-clad legs. Her weight rested almost entirely between her legs, pressing her down deliciously against the taut ridge of muscle that ran along the top of his thigh. He pulled her into him, sliding her down the length of his thigh until her own thigh was pressed hard against his crotch. She could feel his erection straining beneath his trousers. It was the first time she had ever been so close to a man in a state of intense arousal, and it both inflamed and terrified her. There it was, undeniable proof of his desire for her. He could have been exaggerating when he claimed to like heavy girls, but he was not lying now. In a way, it was intensely flattering, the ultimate compliment. Yet this was exactly what she had been determined to avoid from the onset. Desire did not equal the kind of respect and commitment she longed for in a partner, but it was bewitching nonetheless. Bewitching and frightening. She felt as if she were sliding willy-nilly down some unknowable rabbit hole, with no hope of turning back. He pressed fiercely against her, and she felt his full length against her thigh. She remembered the other thing that Amber had said about him, and felt a cold thread of panic winding through her desire. She pulled away, awkward and stumbling, and trying to pull down her skirt all at once. "Brandon, no," she said, struggling to compose herself. I can't." Brandon closed his eyes and nodded, pulling in a deep breath. "Okay," he said. "I mean, it's not that. It's just Jane," he said softly, taking her hand again. "It's okay. You don't have to explain anything to me." Jane looked up at him. His eyes were dilated, thin, coffee-colored rings around deep, glistening black. He brought her hand to his lips. "I can wait," he said. Jane wrapped her arms around herself and looked away, shyness squeezing her in its fists. Her blood still rushed through her veins in a mad hormonal rage, and she could feel her heart thudding in her temples and between her legs. She said nothing. "It's almost midnight," Brandon said. "Why don't you let me take you home?" "Okay," Jane said, putting her glasses back on her face and smiling crookedly. "Just give me a minute," he said. Jane frowned. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Well," he said, "I can't walk the streets like this. I'll get arrested." She looked down at the preposterous bulge tinting his trousers and broke out laughing. "Yeah, right. Very funny," he said, but he was laughing too, and all of Jane's shyness seemed to melt away in that open, candid moment. When Brandon felt civilized enough to stand, he escorted Jane home. The walk was cool and calming and cleared Jane's head of the sticky residue of her crazy desire. She wrapped her fingers around the crook of his elbow as they walked, and for the first time in her life, Jane caught a glimpse of what it might be like to be half of a whole, intimately connected to another human being. Then, too soon, they were on the stoop of Jane's house. "Good night, Jane," he said softly, kissing her again, lightly but lingering. "Good night," she said, and slipped inside before she could start kissing him back, falling back into that dangerous rabbit hole. She peered through the curtains, watching him walk slowly down the driveway. He paused by the mailbox, facing away from her, and stood still for a long moment. Then he turned and headed down the street. She wondered suddenly how he would get home. His neighborhood was a good 20-minute drive away. She had seen buses, but had no idea if they ran this late. Amber had said he lived in a bad area, and she found herself suddenly anxious for him, wishing she had told him to call her and let her know he was home safe. He had given her his home phone number, but she was intimidated by the idea of waking up his revolutionary mother. As if by maternal telepathy, her own mom chose that moment to appear in the hallway, clad in a frowsy plaid bathrobe and clashing pink slippers. "Hi, honey," she said. "How'd it go?" "Fine," Jane replied, distracted. "I was just making some herbal tea," her mother told her. "Want a cup?" Jane wanted nothing more than to curl up in bed and play the events of the evening over and over in her inner theater. But she saw how eager to talk her mother was. She felt a sudden wave of empathy for her mother's loneliness. When was the last time her mom had a date? If she even had one, since Jane's father died. Jane had never heard about it. Now Jane had friends and even a possible boyfriend, and her mother still only had Jane. Jane realized how selfish she had been, always complaining of how hard the constant moving was on her. She had never thought of how it might be for her mother. "Okay, sure, Mom," Jane said, smiling, and followed her mom into the kitchen. Okay, folks, this has been chapters 8 and 9 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Dreamspawn. Hope you're enjoying the book so far. There has been almost 200 pages of character development and not much else, but now we know that Rose, the new character, is the little girl from the beginning of the book. So Jane wasn't the girl from the beginning of the book, but they're friends now. And I will tell you this, I did read ahead just a little bit to see how much longer we got to go without Freddy. And Freddy is going to start popping up in the very next chapter. In chapter 10 and 11, there is some Freddy. And from then on out in the book, he's a prominent part of the novel. So we've had all this character development. We've got Lola, Amber, Jane, Brandon, and now Rose. I do like that the author is getting us invested in these characters, but I think it's going to make that much harder when Freddy starts taking them out, because we know that's how it works, you know. Freddy has his victims, and unfortunately some of these characters that we have got invested in are going to meet their end at Freddy's glove. It's just going to happen. You know, in the other Freddy books, there was a lot of people that died that we didn't really have much backstory on. So this book's going to be interesting. A lot of backstory before the Freddy slasher stuff starts happening. I hope everybody had a great and safe Christmas. I hope everybody has a very happy New Year. I'm going to be doing my very first live stream, if all things go the way I hope they go, then this Friday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, I'll have a live Q&A here on YouTube. I hope everybody comes in and checks it out. I'm going to be holding the drawing during the stream for the 750 subscriber celebration giveaway. The winner of that drawing will receive either Jason X, Planet of the Beast, or A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Dealers. It'll be their choice. Also, at the end of the stream this week, I'll be announcing the details of the upcoming 1,000 subscriber celebration giveaway, where there will be 4 winners in this next giveaway. Guys, thank you for listening. Please check back tomorrow when I'm back with some more of Dreamspawn with Freddy in the narration, I promise. And, yeah, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening and pleasant dreams!